Welcome to our morning military news update. We wish you a joyful day. Now, let's move on to the details. The Trump administration's pursuit of ending the Cuban regime is boosted by the U.S.'s success in overthrowing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and reaching an agreement on Greenland. U.S. President Donald Trump is reportedly seeking regime change in Cuba. According to a report published Thursday by the 4 Daily, the Trump administration is actively seeking figures within the Cuban government who could help broker an agreement to oust the communist regime from power before the end of the year. Cuba has long been an ally of the Venezuelan socialist regime, providing medical, security, and intelligence personnel in exchange for subsidized oil. Nearly 30 Cuban Special Forces soldiers protecting Maduro were killed in the U.S. operation, and their bodies were repatriated last week in a ceremony attended by 94-year-old former leader Raul Castro and current President Miguel Diaz-Canel. Current U.S. intelligence assessments indicate that Cuba is facing severe shortages of essential goods and medicine, as well as frequent power outages. The island nation is likely to run out of fuel within the next few weeks, completely paralyzing its economy. The Trump administration is seeking to block all oil flows from Venezuela to Cuba in an attempt to further weaken the regime. According to reports, the Trump team also targeted Cuba's overseas medical missions, Havana's most important source of foreign exchange revenue, including imposing visa bans on Cuban and foreign officials accused of facilitating the program. However, despite the worsening economic and humanitarian crisis, Cuba maintains close ties with U.S. adversaries, such as Russia and Iran. These relationships are causing increasing unease in Washington. The U.S. arrest of Maduro and subsequent concessions from Venezuela's interim government are seen by the Trump administration as a model for Cuba. According to U.S. officials, meetings with Cuban exiles and civil society groups in Miami and Washington are focused on identifying a figure within the current government willing to reach an agreement with the U.S. The raid aimed at arresting Maduro reportedly also had the support of an insider within the Venezuelan leader's inner circle. While the U.S. has not publicly threatened to use force in Cuba, Trump has stated, "I strongly recommend they reach an agreement before it's too late, before there's no more oil or money." The U.S. leader wrote in a Truth Social post on November 11. U.S. officials also said the audacious raid to remove Maduro from Venezuela should be seen as a veiled threat to Havana. The Cuban government has a choice. Sherry Lin, a State Department official in charge of foreign aid and humanitarian affairs, told reporters last week that if Havana continues its repression and embezzlement of recent U.S. aid shipments, it will be held accountable. What is happening in Venezuela should make it clear to the Cuban regime and every other dictator in the world that President Trump cannot be trifled with. Lequi said, "The era of weakness and chaos, conflict and external interference in our region has ended." The U.S. State Department stated that in the interests of U.S. national security, Cuba needs to be governed competently by a democratic government and rejects allowing our adversaries to establish military and intelligence bases. The Trump administration intends to increase pressure on Cuba while simultaneously negotiating a way out for its leaders. Specifically, 94-year-old Raul Castro, the younger brother of the late leader Fidel Castro, and President Miguel Diaz-Canel are among those targeted. Many U.S. allies also want to end communism in Cuba. However, overthrowing this ill-funded government could plunge Havana into chaos and a humanitarian crisis, something Trump has tried to avoid in Venezuela, where he chose to retain his most loyal figures. According to the article, this leaves Trump's team currently without a clear plan for the next step and raises the question of who could replace the current regime. The Venezuelan model is considered by some to be very difficult to apply to Cuba, a one-party, totalitarian state that bans all political opposition. Unlike Venezuela, where opposition movements, frequent protests, and elections exist, civil society in Cuba is virtually non-existent. For the past 7 decades, the Cuban regime has never been willing to negotiate changes to its political system and has only implemented piecemeal, fragmented economic reforms. However, Trump believes that ending the CTOR era will solidify his legacy and accomplish what President John F. Kennedy failed to do in the 1960s. Trump sent a strong message to Putin after his meeting with Zelensky U.S. President Donald Trump said his message to Russian President Vladimir Putin was that the war in Ukraine must end after what he described as a positive meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum at DVOS on Thursday, the 22nd. The meeting took place against the backdrop of weeks of urgent shuttle talks between Washington and Ukraine, as Ukraine faced intense pressure from Trump to push for a peace deal in the nearly 4-year-long conflict, despite Russia showing little sign of a ceasefire. Following the approximately hour-long exchange, Trump declined to disclose details, only emphasizing that it was an ongoing process and stating that U.S. envoys would arrive in Moscow later that day for negotiations. The day before, when asked about his message to the Kremlin, Trump had said a deal was close. He replied succinctly that the war must end. Zelensky had previously stated he would only go to Davos if he could reach agreements with the U.S. on security guarantees and post-war reconstruction funding, but the meeting showed no clear signs of a breakthrough. Since President Trump returned to the White House last year and shifted U.S. policy towards strengthening diplomatic relations with Russia, the two leaders of the U.S. and Ukraine have met in person numerous times. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine Steve R.C. said he had made significant progress and that if both sides are willing to resolve the conflict, it is achievable. WC is expected to travel to Moscow with Cherner to hold talks with President Putin on a possible plan to end the war, followed by talks in Abu Dhabi, including military dialogue and a prosperity support package. Russia has been wary of the U.S.-led peace initiative that continues to demand territorial concessions from Ukraine in the east. President Putin said he would discuss a solution for Ukraine, the possibility of using frozen Russian assets to rebuild areas controlled by Moscow, as well as Trump's proposal for a global peace council, an initiative criticized for potentially undermining the role of the United Nations. On the same day, Ukrainian President Zelensky announced that officials from the United States, Ukraine, and Russia would hold trilateral talks in the United Arab Emirates starting Friday, February 23. This marks an acceleration of peace negotiations aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. While diplomacy is underway, Russia continues its airstrikes on Ukraine. In Odessa, a 17-year-old was killed by a drone strike in Kryvyi, and ballistic missiles injured 11 others. In Kyiv, nearly 3,000 high-rise buildings remain without heating after recent attacks, indicating that the conflict on the ground remains intense. Amid the energy crisis, Poland sends 400 generators as relief. Ladies and gentlemen, Poland has stepped up its emergency support for Ukraine by sending more than 400 generators from its national reserves to the country and surrounding regions. This comes as the Ukrainian capital is experiencing its most severe energy crisis since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Polish ambassador to Ukraine, Piotr Lukas, announced on May 22nd that generators were en route to help the people of Kyiv get through the harsh winter. The shipments arrived just as Kyiv's power system was severely damaged by Russian attacks on May 9th, 13th, and 20th, 2026. These airstrikes damaged many key substations and thermal power plants, severely disrupting the capital's energy cycle. As a result, authorities were forced to drain water from the heating systems of approximately 6,000 buildings as temperatures dropped to 59 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving hundreds of thousands without heating and electricity. Besides government support, Polish citizens have also actively joined hands to help Ukraine. Through a fundraising campaign launched by the Stand Ukraine organization demonstrating Polish warmth for Ukraine, more than 42,000 benefactors donated nearly 5.32 million sloths in just 6 days. Large businesses also participated, with Poland Nutra and the Kojic Foundation contributing 500,000 sloths to purchase 120 generators. Dominika Kojic, Poland's richest woman, called on the entire Polish energy sector to join in the support effort. The amount raised exceeded initial expectations, forcing organizers to double their target within just a few days. Meanwhile, KP is gradually recovering. On the 21st, energy engineers restored all critical infrastructure, and authorities announced that heating would soon be restored to over 3,000 households. 2 cogeneration plants from Germany are expected to arrive soon, and the emergency power outage schedule will shift to a strict but predictable mode. The energy crisis is not limited to the KP. as Russia continues its attacks on infrastructure across Ukraine, forcing 17 countries to provide energy equipment. The Ukrainian cabinet has allocated 2.56 billion hryvnia to purchase additional high-capacity generators. Throughout the war, Poland has remained a pillar of energy support for Ukraine. From Starlink battery storage to a willingness to increase electricity exports, affirming its role as a key partner during the most difficult times, Trump established a peace council to compete with the role of the United Nations. U.S. President Donald Trump officially launched a peace council on Thursday, an initiative initially aimed at bolstering the fragile ceasefire agreement, but which he hopes will play a broader role in resolving global conflicts. While Trump insisted the council would coordinate with the United Nations, many powerful nations have expressed concerns that this new mechanism could undermine the UN's traditional role as a central forum for international diplomacy and peace governance. Mr. Trump, who holds the position of council chairman, argued that once fully established, the Peace Council could do almost anything it wanted, while emphasizing that the United Nations has great but untapped potential. He invited dozens of world leaders to participate and proposed that permanent members each contribute $1 billion to fund peace initiatives. However, at the signing ceremony, writers noted the absence of representatives from leading powers such as Israel or the Palestinian Authority. Several regional powers, such as Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and emerging countries like Indonesia, registered to participate, while many Western allies and global powers remained cautious. France declined to participate, Britain said it had not yet joined, and China has not yet taken a clear stance. Russia said it was studying the proposal. President Vladimir Putin raised the possibility of contributing $1 billion from frozen U.S. assets to support the Palestinians. This peace council was established primarily to monitor the ceasefire in Gaza, but U.S. officials say it will be expanded to other conflict zones. A court official confirmed to the Keep Independent that the council could play a role in other situations, depending on the chairman's decision and the consent of the countries involved, without ruling out intervention in Russia's war in Ukraine. President Vladimir Zelensky said Ukraine had also received an invitation, but stressed that any such efforts could only take place after the war ends. With the Russians, we are enemies of Belarus. They are allies of Russia. We cannot side with them. I think that establishing a monitoring mission can only be done after the war ends for us. Mr. Zelensky said, Trump's Greenland strategy locks down the influence of China and Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, following the meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the World Economic Forum in Davos on 21st, NATO reaffirmed its commitment to ensuring the security of the Arctic region while preventing China and Russia from establishing lasting influence in this strategic area. According to NATO spokesperson Allison H., the meeting was deemed highly effective, focusing on the vital importance of Arctic security to the entire alliance, including the United States. While specific details of the new policy framework have not been released, NATO confirmed that discussions are underway around building a collective cooperation mechanism to protect the Arctic, particularly through the coordination of the 7 Arctic nations in the bloc. Barr stressed that dialogues between Denmark, Greenland, and the U.S. would continue with the goal of ensuring that Russia and China could not gain a foothold in Greenland, whether economically or militarily. Earlier that day, President Trump and Secretary General Rutte discussed the possibility of the U.S. gaining control of Greenland through diplomatic means. Speaking at David, Mark Rutte publicly endorsed Trump's assessment of China's and Russia's increasingly aggressive activities in the Arctic, arguing that new shipping lanes opened by melting ice provide opportunities for these two countries to increase their presence, thereby posing a serious security challenge to NATO. Following the meeting, Trump posted on Twitter that an agreement was being proposed and, if approved, would greatly benefit the U.S. and NATO as a whole. U.S. Vice President Trady France, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the STC envoy were tasked with finalizing negotiations in the coming weeks. At the same time, Trump withdrew his threat to impose additional tariffs on 8 NATO countries that had opposed the plan to control Greenland. Trump emphasized that Greenland is a top national security priority and a key component in the U.S.'s missile defense system. He argued that Greenland being under U.S. control would make NATO stronger and more effective. A new gas field has been discovered in the disputed South China Sea. The Philippines has just recorded its first natural gas discovery in over a decade in the South China Sea, a region with complex territorial disputes. This provides a significant boost to the country's goal of increasing its energy independence. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. described it as a significant discovery, with initial estimates suggesting the new gas field contains approximately 98 billion cubic feet of natural gas, enough to power about 5.7 million Philippine households. The new field, named Malapa X1, is located a few miles east of the existing Malampacra field and about 50 miles northwest of Paraguayan province, entirely within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Preliminary tests suggest the field could supply up to 60 million cubic feet of natural gas per day. While this output is modest compared to Malampaya's current total production of approximately 429 million cubic feet per day, the new discovery is expected to help extend the lifespan of the Malampaya field, the Philippines' only domestic natural gas source, which currently meets about 20% of Long Island's energy needs, a sharp decline from 40% previously. Many experts have warned that Malampa could be depleted within the next few years. The discovery of the Malampa mod, made by a fully Philippine joint venture of Prime Energy Resources Development and domestic partners, reflects the Philippines' growing capacity in upstream energy development. This has strategic significance given that the South China Sea is estimated to contain over 40 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, but it is a particularly contentious area, especially with China increasing its naval presence to assert its sovereignty claims. Compared to other claimant states, the Philippines is believed to have the smallest proven and exploitable gas reserves. However, the government is continuing to push forward with exploration, with 2 additional drilling sites under monitoring and expected to yield initial results by the end of the first quarter, demonstrating its determination to strengthen long-term energy security. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning's military news update concludes here. Thank you for your time. Hello, and see you again in the next program.